welcome to this episode of the Tennis IQ podcast. I'm Brian Lomax.
And I'm Josh Berger. And in today's episode, we're going to be talking about clutch performances, where we'll define this term of what makes a performance clutch. We will talk about how we can create clutch performances, what are some characteristics of clutch performances themselves, and thinking about the mindset that you want to develop and work on ahead of time in order to increase your likelihood of having a clutch performance, of performing well, really when it matters most. Now we see really at all levels of the sport big moments. And Brian and I were talking off air how and tennis is unique in that there's no hiding. It's just you out there. Perhaps it's you and a doubles partner, but you are called upon to hit that game winning shot, or to at least attempt that game winning shot pretty much whenever you're out there. And the having the skill set and having the mindset needed to perform well and having that clarity of mind during those big moments is not easy. And we see it at all levels, at the professional level, where in the biggest moments at match point, we've seen even some of the greatest players of all time stumble in these moments. And as we know, if some of the greatest players of all time will stumble in these moments, then it's even more likely that everyone else will also struggle to handle these moments in the best possible way much of the time. So during this episode, we'll talk about some of the reasons why that might be. What are some of the pitfalls to performing at our best during clutch moments, during big moments. How might we increase our likelihood of performing well in those moments, and then talk a little bit about that type of mindset and how we can prepare for those clutch moments and biggest moments ahead of time.
I think this topic is it's resonated with me for a while, Josh, because there are certain losses that I have in my own career. When I look back, I noticed that a certain moment came and I didn't step up. It's not that I stepped back or did anything wrong, but what happened was my opponent stepped up and created a clutch performance. And when we think about clutch performances, sort of our tagline here is make it happen. You have to recognize this and you have to make it happen. And I distinctly remember several matches in which I did not make it happen. I didn't choke, I didn't play worse, but I didn't rise up and recognize the moment. And then upon reflection, I noticed, my opponents did. So this is a really big part of being a great tennis competitor. Because if you're in the match, there's going to be some clutch moments that come up. And so, yeah, I really like talking about this. And I also like talking about it, comparing it to flow, contrasting it with flow, how it maybe interweaves with flow, because there are certainly intersections here. But as you go through a match, flow being more like how we get in the zone or being in the zone, that type of thing, playing your best peak performance. But clutch is something that's related, but it's probably more momentary, probably called for at different times. And that's why I think this is really kind of cool. And and we'll get into this, but I've used this as being an on-court coach and found that to be very helpful. And so I think not only are we having this conversation for players, but also for coaches, especially college coaches who can be talking to their players during a match. You as a coach may recognize something more quickly than your player does at a certain moment in time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point that um, oftentimes the coach who maybe is not actually or who isn't actually playing in that moment, but is present, is able to talk to that player, might be able to actually recognize that moment, or recognize maybe a hidden moment, a hidden opportunity, and help make that player aware of it, help maybe remind that player of a skill or a mental tool that they've worked on that could be helpful during that time. So I think that's a great point that sometimes these sorts of moments, sometimes it's really obvious, right? It's a third set tiebreaker. I think just about everybody's going to recognize that this is a huge moment. But sometimes it's a lot more subtle. Maybe it's a deuce point when we're playing no ads. Maybe it's break point somewhere in the middle of the set, and it's important to recognize that hey, this is a huge moment. This is a moment that could potentially shift this set or shift this whole match. So yes, from the vantage point of a coach or from even an outside observer, being able to recognize that is important, and also for the performer themselves, starting to notice these moments in your own matches and your own performances as well as in others is a huge step, right? If you're aware that this is a clutch opportunity, an opportunity to have a clutch performance, then you can think about that plan that you've practiced. Then you can think about that preparation and that mindset that you want to embody. um, but until that awareness piece is achieved, until you're realizing the moment that you're in, it's tough to really activate that type of mindset that you want to have.
And I think when we're talking about clutch moments in tennis, it really brings to light that not every point is of equal weight in a tennis match. And sometimes, as coaches or sports psych professionals, we'll ask our players to play every point as if it is the most important point in the match. And that's a good general approach. And we're not actually being contradictory here, but there's also a skill of having some situational awareness and knowing that this point actually means more. There's more riding on, say, break point or a deuce point than, say, first point of a game or love 15. Um, and so that's a big part of understanding how clutch and flow go together, or how playing every point as if it's the most important is an important concept. But then again, hey, this is a moment that I really need to step up and increase that. Um, and so I don't want us to sound like we're contradicting anything here, but there are going to be moments where we don't want to be oblivious to the situation. Because as I described just in my own past, if you remain the same and your opponent steps up, you probably lose. And that's a real world scenario. So we can increase our focus, we can increase our intensity, we can change our emotions about a certain situation with respect to pressure. And those are some of the things that we want to get into today about how to do that. What does that look like for each of you? Because it's going to be different. We're all going to use different emotions, different thought processes, different focal points. Um, but I want to make sure that we understand, yes, we always want to play the next point as if it's the most important one, but you also need to be situationally aware. And this could be a good exercise for everybody to think about, what are the clutch moments in a match? You mentioned more subtle ones, right? It could be 3-all in the second set, and maybe it's a deuce point or a break point. That could be huge. That could be the end of the match if you step up and take that opportunity. Certainly, as you get to the business end of sets, 4-all, 5-all, a lot of the points there, or even those games, are clutch moments. And if we think of when do the clutch moments happen in tennis? And we're talking about maybe situationally, but just in general, they're important moments. There are moments where potentially the outcome is on the line. And of course, in order for a moment to be clutch, you have to be in contention. If you're getting blown out, there are probably very few clutch moments there. But if we're talking about a match that's close, that's getting at least to say 3-all in each set and beyond that, then you're in contention. And so it's a matter of perhaps even making an inventory of what you think some clutch moments could be, so that when they come up, you recognize those.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think we want to recognize them. I think that's a huge step. I think it's important for athletes to think back to some moments where they've really performed well in the past during big moments.
Yeah,
Try to think back to what your mindset was like. Was it, as you said, Brian, was this a situation where where you were going for it? Or were you sort of letting it, were you making it happen or were you letting it
letting it
happen?
happen. Exactly.
Right? So were you taking it to the other player? Were you trying to play aggressively? Were you maybe coming up to net, putting pressure on your opponent? Or were you hoping for them to miss? And I think if you think back to some of those best moments, it was probably the former. It was probably you being aggressive, you going for your shots without that fear of missing, without viewing this as a threat of, oh, I hope I don't miss here. But no, this is an opportunity to be clutch and an opportunity to win the match ultimately. So I also think there's something to I think there's some overlap in terms of the type of mindset that you want to have as sort of you look back at a match where you want to feel that you went out, win or lose, I will add, you want to feel that you went out going for it. You don't want to have regrets that, hey, I didn't go for my shots there. What if I went for my shots? What would have happened? But instead, if you go for your shots, win or lose, you can leave that, leave the court with your head held high, and not have regrets that you didn't go for it. And ultimately, I think as tennis players look back at their finest performances and most clutch performances, you'll find the same. These are the moments where you did go for your shots, where you trusted yourself, and you played free and went for it. So I think that's as we start to talk about how we can create some of these clutch performances, recognizing that moment, and committing to a game plan and committing to your game, and to going for your shots. And again, what this looks like is going to look a little different based on a few things, based on your playing style, based on your strengths. But those are definitely a couple of key points to consider as we start to talk about that.
I think another thing it goes in with what you were saying with trust is you have to have confidence in your game, but you also have to have self belief that you can do this. Because if we shift gears and look at other sports, because as you said, Josh, in tennis you can't escape the spotlight. You if you're in a clutch or a potential clutch moment, you can't tag out. You can't ask your coach to sub you out. You've got to face it. And when we look at sports like basketball, and you think of some of the great clutch performers in basketball, you know, in today's game, it's LeBron James, Steph Curry, Giannis. In the past, Michael Jordan, Larry Bird, um, Magic Johnson. These were players who had the self belief and confidence that even though there was a risk of failure, they wanted the ball. And I think that that is actually something as tennis players, when we think about creating a clutch moment or a clutch performance, is wanting the ball. I want to serve for the match. I want to serve for the set, or I want to play this point. And we'll get into some questions that players can ask themselves. But I think this is a general thing. And this is what distinguishes in a sport like basketball those who are called upon to take the last shot and those maybe who don't want to take the last shot. It takes a special player to do something like that, even though there's a risk of failure. And we as tennis players, we live with that risk all the time. You can't escape it. So I think this is an important concept. Yes, we can admire the clutch performers in other sports, but also know that we get lots of opportunities to practice being clutch in a sport like tennis. And so, yeah, Josh, you kind of started to allude to, how do you create it? I think versus like is recognizing that, understanding that. And then, there's different things we can do from there. really assessing that situation, and then um, maybe it's also about you raising your effort and intensity in that moment. Maybe you set more specific goals. It's got to be something that helps you just go a little bit further up, a little bit more to the whole thing because it is a big moment in the match.
Yeah, I think those are some excellent and really helpful guidelines. That one thing I would add to that, and this is something we've definitely touched on a number of times on this show, is the need to put yourself in these clutch situations more often. So through more match play, through more tournaments, through more practice matches, you start to put yourself in these big moments on a more regular basis, and you have more opportunities to practice trying to handle these types of situations. Where if you aren't, frequently playing in a tiebreaker, or serving at 5-all or 5-6 at the end of a set, it's going to be a lot tougher to have the peace of mind to do any of these things from my experience, in my opinion. So that's one thing that I would add in. But no, I really liked all of that, what you're saying. I think we talked a little bit about flow and the crossover here, and maybe some similarities. And of course, we have an episode devoted to that if you want to hear more about that particular topic. But one thing that stood out to me, Brian, is when you talked about setting some specific goals, and that was something during our flow episode, and within that concept in general, that's very important. Having a specific goal and a specific target in mind is a characteristic for increasing your likelihood to achieve flow, right? If you are all over the place with what you want to achieve and where you're going with a particular shot, it's a lot harder to get into that type of type of mindset that's going to help you achieve flow. And it's the same thing during these high pressure, biggest moments. You need a clear target. Oftentimes, maybe when you're returning serve, that's just that first shot where you want to return. Is it deep down the middle on a first serve? Are you trying to be aggressive and attack that second serve? Are you trying to set up your serve and your first ball when you're serving, right? Having a clear target and a clear game plan, I think, is a huge piece of this, right? So you're not going in blind. You have a game plan, and then it's just about execution, you know, and then having that mindset to to embrace that moment and to go for it, and not, as you said, not just let it happen, but make it happen. Commit to making it happen. And I think part of that is understanding ahead of time that you might fail, you might you might miss, you might lose the match, and accepting that ahead of time, planning some of this out ahead of time, having these conversations, thinking some of this stuff through, but understanding that, hey, you're going to miss sometimes. And despite that, maybe, yeah, despite that, you could even say because of that, that do you still nonetheless want to and need to commit to your shots and go for your shots in those moments, in order to play your best, in order to make it happen, in order to raise your level. If you're going to keep doing what you're doing, then your level won't raise. And as you said, Brian, if the other player decides to go for it, they increase their chances of making it happen. So no, I think those are some great guidelines in terms of how to increase your likelihood for a clutch performance. And I think another thing we can come back to is there are no guarantees, right? We're talking about increasing your likelihood. We're talking about making this more probable, but ultimately, certain things are out of our control. We can do all of these things. We can perform really well, and the person on the other side of the net could be having their best day, or we could get really unlucky and the ball could trickle over to our side of the net a couple times during the game, and we could lose the game. But we were trying to control the controllables and doing everything within our power to give ourselves a good chance to create this performance. And I think these are some excellent guidelines. And I think part of it is that mindset going into it, then that preparation piece, and then part of it is recognizing it in that moment, and then that commitment piece, and accepting the result, and accepting that certain things are out of our control, and that, you know, despite that, we're going to go for it because we know that that's what gives us the best possible chance.
And some of what you said there, Josh, made me think of the Michael Jordan quote, which I don't have in front of me, but it's all a lot about how he's missed so many shots and lost so many games and failed so many times, but that is why he is a success because he's practiced this over and over again. And I think one of the differences between tennis and a sport like basketball is unless it's match point, even if you mess up a clutch moment, there are probably more to come. You still haven't lost. You're still in it. And so there may be another clutch moment coming up. And, you know, I can think of matches in which there are multiple clutch moments that you have to step up and perhaps repeatedly do what we're talking about, repeatedly recognize the moment, assess that situation for what it is right now. Doesn't matter if I messed up the last one. Here we are again. It's another clutch moment. Let me accept the challenge, embrace that challenge. Let me set my goals for this point, which is what do I want to do? What are my targets? What's my plan here so I can do that? And then again, step up the effort and intensity and the focus and go after it. And so you may actually get many clutch opportunities in just one match. And again, as long as you haven't played match point, you're still in it. So we have to keep that in mind that, you know what, there may be another clutch moment coming up. I've got to be ready. I've got to really kind of hone in on how I handle this. And it's just a learning thing. And I fully agree with you that we want to be practicing these scenarios more and more. The more that players and coaches can embrace pressure training into what they do. Some people may call it simulation training. You might call it pressure training, where perhaps you put some consequences on what you're doing. And consequences don't have to be push ups or punishments, they can also be rewards. But it could also be something like, okay, we're just keeping track of your scores. Or you're just being evaluated by a coach. A coach is watching you and perhaps judging some of the things you're doing. So there are different consequences that you could add on to help players feel more pressure, feel like there are consequences, so that when they get into real world situations and a clutch moment comes up, they can handle that better because they've trained for it. They've played under, um, some duress in practice where there have been some consequences. So I think in terms of creating that clutch performance, I think we've given a pretty good framework for doing that. Um, and then what do we want to achieve when we get into that clutch moment? What does that look like?
Yeah, I think as you know, what we want that to look like. I mean, it's there's this is the part where I think there's more crossover into our conversation on flow,
Yeah.
right? Where we talk about um, you know just complete focus, right? Complete deliberate focus, trying to get into a point where you can really get into the moment and get into the zone as much as possible during this big moment. So having heightened awareness, being able to reach a higher level of focus, having an feeling like some of your skills, or feeling like things are a little bit more automatic, where maybe you don't have to be as thoughtful about how to hit your forehand or your backhand, and you're thinking about getting your elbow back or any of these things, but you're able to things can start to feel a little bit effortless during those moments when you're feeling clutch, when you're in that moment. I know the research that it also talks about having heightened arousal, not having negative thoughts, increasing the intensity of our effort. And again, there is some crossover here. Brian, you did touch on some of these, some of the differences. But I think we can all look back at perhaps some of our own clutch performances, and certainly many clutch performances of professional athletes. I mean, Novak Djokovic is to me, probably the I can't think of anybody who's come back from match point down as many times. Or just being down and down in matches. I mean, even just recently, against Stefanos Tsitsipas down in the finals. So the being in the French Open finals, being down 2 sets, um, and being able to come back from that. So I whether it's that, whether it's being 5-love down, and then ultimately losing that first set to Nadal at the French Open in the semifinals, the match before that, coming back, whether it's him saving multiple match points against Federer in Grand Slam semifinals and finals. He is the type of person who has demonstrated an ability to embody a lot of these characteristics that we're talking about, where actually, and I don't think this is something we've talked about, but when he's returning serve, sometimes you'll notice it's almost as if his eyes get really, really big. And it seems that he's trying to, really get into that moment. It seems like he's, engaging his breathing. It seems like he is just almost reminding himself and using some tools, some mental tools, and in order to get into the moment better, in order to fully be mindful and be aware of everything that's in front of him in that moment, right? It might be 40-15 match point down. It might be during a tie break, but he has this striking ability, and at least he has developed it over the years, right? It wasn't always something that he had. I think back to earlier in his career when he, lost, when he was almost perpetually number three behind Nadal and Federer, and had lost, a number of finals and semifinals to these players. And to me, one of the biggest reasons he's been able to turn his career into one where he's, really making the case for greatest of all time is because of his performance during these clutch moments, is because of this effort and intensity that he's been able to produce during these moments, where it almost just seems like a complete sense of focus and awareness um, has, comes over him. And he almost is able to find this mode of not missing. And as we talked about with, what going for it or making it happen looks like for each player, that's a little bit different. For him, a player that can cover the court really well and can find, levels of consistency that other players just can't achieve. For him, making it happen might mean not missing, keeping the ball deep, and then when the opportunity presents itself, going for the winner. Where for another player, making it happen might mean first strike tennis a little bit more. So I think that's an important point as well. But I think we can look at him. We could certainly look at the other big three in men's tennis, Nadal and Federer, and a number of their most clutch moments. And on the women's side, there's certainly plenty of examples as well. Naomi Osaka certainly comes to mind, as well as Ash Barty, I will say. Serena certainly throughout her career. So no, I think there's countless examples that we can look towards in terms of the best athletes in the world finding that mode, finding that level that's needed in order to perform at this to perform their best during these clutch moments. And I think a lot of these characteristics that we're talking about, by trying to embrace them and trying to notice these moments and then activate this type of mindset that we're talking about during these moments can increase your chances of performing well and bringing out some of your best tennis during these moments, despite the pressure, despite the fact that your heart might be racing, despite the fact that maybe you're thinking about the future and what if I win this match? What is, who am I playing next? I can't wait to play that person tomorrow or later this afternoon. Or, thinking about what if I lose this match, but really embracing that moment, being mindful and trying to really activate this skill set and this mindset that we're talking about.
As you were talking about Novak Djokovic, it made me think about our French Open recap from a month or so ago when we were discussing the fact that he was down 2 sets to love to Tsitsipas in the final. And as you're describing that, I'm like, the big clutch moment in that match was beginning of the third set. And we talked a lot about what he said in his press conference, how he went off the court. And so if we look at the characteristics of a clutch performance, um, or recognizing that, right, when it is, um, he did recognize that this was a big moment. He turned around his self-talk in that moment. He challenged himself to be better out there. He talked to himself in a way that got him to increase his effort and intensity at the beginning. Set some specific goals about, like you said, Josh, pretty much not missing. I'm going to refuse to miss. I'm going to hit with confidence, but I will not be missing anymore. And he just embraced that situation, and it just turned the match around. And so that's a perfect example, I think, also of there are going to be matches where you're not playing great, yet you still may find yourself in a clutch opportunity, a clutch moment. You've got to be mindful and aware of the situation. And it doesn't matter if you haven't been playing well up until that moment. All that matters is the moment is here. What are you going to do about it? And this is where you need to be present. You need to be mindful of that. And that's what Djokovic did. Didn't matter that he didn't play his best tennis in those first two sets. He was still in the match, came out, turned it around. And as Tsitsipas said in his press conference, it was like he was playing a completely different player because he got into what we see with that crossover with Flo. Djokovic was much more confident in his game. He was much more focused. Um, his effort had increased. He didn't look tired like he did in the second set because he looked tired in that second set. The negative voice, he put it to the side and used his more positive, productive voice. And then he had no doubt in his skills from then on. And as he said, from there on, the doubts went away. He was able to play the way he wanted to from then on. So, really great example, I think, of someone who wasn't playing well, recognized a clutch moment, and then it turned it around.
Yeah, yeah, and I think what I think that beginning of the third set is an opportunity, right? Is maybe one of these hidden moments where you wouldn't always think, okay, the beginning of the set. Not every player is has that awareness, has that recognition that okay, this is a chance to turn that match around. A lot of players, if it's 6-all and it's time for the tiebreaker and it's match point, obviously you're going to be awake and notice what's going on. But oftentimes it is the beginning of the set where things can really shift. Maybe it's most people who are listening probably aren't playing five setters too often, but or best of five matches. But maybe it's the beginning of the second set. Maybe a player lost the first set. They're maybe down and out, they feel defeated, but you get up a break in that second set, and just that brief moment is what makes you able to turn that match around. I think another important point is that we often talk about the scoring system of tennis, how it can be um, you know very challenging because if yeah for a couple of reasons, but every point it does is counts as 1 point, but as we know, as we've talked about, that they're not all equal, and there is no way to just run out the clock, right? But on the other side of things, that as you've alluded to, Brian, that means that you will have more opportunities. Unless it's a match point, there will be other opportunities. There's no way for the other player to run out the clock. And as long as you continue to play well, as long as you continue to win points, you're still in the match. So there's sort of always that possibility of turning a match around. I think there's plenty of examples of players turning around sets from being down 5-love, 5-1, turning around to, tiebreakers from um, scores that, you wouldn't have imagined. But really, if you start winning points, or you even start winning by by winning 1 point, that, as I think we've all seen, that can turn into a chain reaction that can lead um, to better and better results, and then ultimately turn a match around. Um, so I think as we think a little bit more about this topic, I think oftentimes there's almost the assumption that people might play worse during these moments because of what they're experiencing, because they might not be, feeling their best. They might be, afraid of some of the consequences of losing during that moment or missing during that moment. But as you said, Brian, there is that opportunity to rise to the occasion, to really go for it during that moment. And perhaps there's even that opportunity if you haven't been playing your best. If if things haven't been going well, you're the higher rated player, you're the higher ranked player, and all of a sudden you're in a 3-set battle, and maybe in the back of your mind you didn't envision the match going this way. You're frustrated, but do you have are you able to be mindful enough of the moment to put whatever's happened in the past over the last set or two or three behind you, and focus on the moment and focus on, okay, what's important right now? What's going to help me during this moment to produce a clutch performance, to perform well? And and generally that's not thinking back to those previous sets and thinking back to maybe you not performing your best, or obviously thinking of the future and the what ifs, and getting all of that started, getting that whole thought process started. So finding that clarity of the moment, and oftentimes it can be through a deep breath. It can be through some of these routines we've talked about. It can be through maybe that 90 seconds that you have during a changeover, where you're able to slow things down for a second and recognize what there's this moment that's in front of you, and decide to go for it and decide to try to make it happen.
I think along with that, and we discussed this earlier in the conversation, in that moment, you've got to rely on your self belief. You've got to believe that you can win. Um, because if you don't have that, then you're not going to step up. So there has to be that basis that I can win, I can succeed in this moment. Because oftentimes it's the difference between playing to win in that moment or something else. You may not be playing not to lose, but maybe you're not exactly playing to win. And that's where we've got to recognize that this is a moment for me to step up and I want to play to win. I want to make something happen. That's what we're talking about. Don't just let the match happen. Recognize this moment, make something happen. Um, so I think with that in mind, we could start to give the listeners a framework for helping them develop a clutch performance or develop their mindset for a clutch performance. And I think this is where it's going to be different for everyone. I don't think there's any right answers here, and we can talk about some of the questions that we've put together, and what some potential answers are. But I think these are good questions for the listeners to come up with. Um, and I think the first thing that we want to think about is how do we envision seeing ourselves play? This is almost like making sure that you have a vision so that you're kind of starting with the end in mind. So this is how I want to play. So we want to start with that. So I think a good question for players would be, how would you ideally like to perform in such clutch moments? We've talked a lot about different characteristics of what that looks like, but individually you may break that down into some more specifics. As you said, Josh, some players may be more like a Federer and very aggressive and looking to be for a strike. Others may be more like Djokovic, who are going to break you down with their level of consistency, and they may even induce errors from their opponents because it's just impossible to hit a winner. So we all have to know what our strengths are when we look to ideally perform in that moment. So I'm just curious about you, maybe if you have any additional thoughts about setting that vision for how you want to play.
Yeah, I think it's important to be really clear about your playing style and your game plan. I think this is also I would say visualization and actually going through that mental rehearsal of some of these moments and seeing yourself playing the way that you are preparing to or are envisioning is important here. As well as planning out some of that self-talk ahead of time.
Yeah,
So knowing, okay, this is the moment we're gonna go, telling yourself go for it, or telling yourself, this is the moment, or telling yourself this is what we practice for, or whatever it is. Again, it's going to be different for each person, but figuring out what works best for you and trying to plan out some of this stuff, planning out, okay, what is my playing style, what are some patterns I really like, what are some things I can tell myself, in terms of self-talk. And the more that you can prepare ahead of time, in terms of that mental rehearsal, and imagery visualization, um, you know preparing, maybe writing down what are some potential scenarios you might find yourself in, and then how you want to actually handle some of these. For instance, okay, maybe it's you're down 4-5 in the set, or it's the end of the tiebreaker or whatever it is. But writing it down, thinking about some of these emotions and feelings you might be experiencing in that moment, and then coming up with a clear game plan for how you're going to handle it and how you're going to respond in that moment, so that when that moment occurs, and it will occur, especially if you play enough matches, you will find yourself in these big moments time and time again. That you have a plan for how you're going to handle it. You're not just winging it, and also trying to learn from these experiences. It's all data. It's all it's all just more matches, and the more that you can learn from each time you're out there, what you did well, what didn't go so well, what you learned from it, then the better chance you have of doing a little bit better the next time around.
I think your idea of planning this out is spot on. And so when we have a sense of how we want to perform there, yeah, let's create some self talk that defines more like our attitude toward this situation. So, like you said, hey, this is what I want, this is why we're here, right? Those are great phrases to use to get you then to feel like you're embracing it, accepting the challenge, which is a big part of being clutch, is embracing that. You mentioned the emotions. Yeah, there might be some typical emotions, but what are the emotions you want to use? And this really is going to be different for everybody. We all have different productive emotions that help us to function in an optimal way. So, what are those for you? What are the ones that you want to use? And I would strongly suggest adding something about your confidence and self belief into that part of your planning out this process. And then lastly, what are you going to focus on? What are some of the controllables that perhaps you can narrow it down to? Because I think when we talk about a clutch performance, yeah, it's about flow or being in the zone. But to me, it's like when you watch it, you feel like somebody's just locked in. Like you said with Djokovic in his eyes, they're just locked into the performance. And so when you're planning out how you want to approach these situations, you want it to be something that you can really lock into. And very often that can be something simple, or should be something simple like your routines, or I'm just going to be focusing on attacking the ball. I talked to a student today, good national adult player. His big focal point is simply attacking the contact point, always doing that. Like, that's great. It keeps it simple, and that's something you can really emphasize in a clutch moment, because we might be a little bit nervous and we're not attacking that. Maybe we're just backing away from that. And that's got a lot to do with the eyes. So I think that that's something everybody should really plan out, is how they want to do this. If you're a coach, say you're a college coach, have your players do this. And then you look at the responses so that when you coach them individually, you know what to say to that player versus another player. You have a better sense of what this player's clutch performance looks like or wants to look like versus another. Maybe they've got a different deuce point play than another player, and you want to be aware of that as a coach so that you can be encouraging those types of things. But yeah, like we said at the beginning, I love this stuff because I think as a coach, um, this was really, even though I went over this stuff with the team, I found it truly helpful as a college coach to know about all these things. Because in a way, when you're doing college coaching, you're actually really a part of the team. You're helping that player in that moment, which most other sports get to do. We don't normally get to do that. Um, and so you can, by you just keeping your wits about you, staying calm yourself, becomes easier to recognize this stuff and then help your player through it all.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a great point. I think being yeah, college coaches are in a unique position to actually talk to that player in the moment, maybe during a changeover, as they're changing ends, and remind them of some of this stuff. I think that's a great point, and I think I just think about a place maybe to end things on, as we start to wrap up, could be just trying to have that mindset of embracing that moment, of viewing it as a challenge, viewing it as an opportunity rather than a threat. I think the more that you can get into that mindset, the less pressure you'll feel, the less negative emotions hopefully you'll be feeling, and the more that you could go for it, and the more that you can lean towards that moment rather than backing away from it.
Yeah, and I would say maybe just for me to end on this, think about some of your favorite clutch performers. Be that player, even if it's from a different sport. If you love LeBron James or Michael Jordan, be the Michael Jordan of tennis, or be Novak Djokovic, be whatever. Notice, have some clutch performer in your mind that you can aspire to be. Um, and I think that can be very, very helpful because now you have a model for how to go out and do this stuff. All right, well, that's our show for today. Thank you all for listening. For more on today's show, please check out the show notes. If you have any feedback or questions for me and Josh, please email us at tennisiqpodcast@gmail.com. You can also send us questions via the Twitter hashtag tennisiq. Additionally, please subscribe to the show on your podcast platform of choice, including YouTube, so you can be notified of new episodes. You can also check out our Instagram account. Thanks again, and we will speak to you soon in our next episode.